When someone truly cares for you, it's not always loud or dramatic. It's in the way they check on you after a hard day, the way they understand your silence, or how they love you without demanding you to be perfect. But for avoidants, people who fear emotional closeness, this kind of love can feel threatening. They convince themselves they don't need it. They tell themselves, "I'm fine alone." Until one day, the person who cared stops trying. And that's when the reality begins to sink in. The illusion of control is one of the most deceptive emotional shields avoidants build around themselves. It starts subtly, almost innocently. They tell themselves they just value space, that they think clearly when alone, that too much closeness makes them lose focus or identity. At first, this reasoning feels empowering, as if detachment equals emotional intelligence. They learn to equate independence with safety, and emotional distance with strength. But this illusion only lasts until someone truly genuine enters their life. Someone who offers patience, care, and understanding without trying to control them. And suddenly, the defense system that once kept them safe begins to work against them. Avoidants often believe they're maintaining control by keeping others at arm's length. They believe if they don't rely on anyone, they won't get hurt. They think love makes them vulnerable, and vulnerability means losing power. So, they build walls, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. They hide behind logic, business, and emotional withdrawal, convincing themselves they're fine. But love doesn't thrive in control, it thrives in connection. And when that connection is withheld, even unintentionally, it begins to fade. The person who once cared deeply starts to feel unseen, unappreciated, and emotionally exhausted. Eventually, they stop trying. That's when the illusion of control starts to crumble. When the person who truly cared finally walks away, the avoidant's inner narrative begins to collapse. They no longer feel in control. They feel confused. What once felt like peace now feels like emptiness. What once felt like freedom now feels like loss. They start to notice the spaces in their daily routine that person used to fill. The good morning text, the supportive message, the soft reminder that they weren't alone. Suddenly their life is quieter, but not calmer. It's in that silence that they begin to see that control was never about strength, it was about fear. Fear of being seen too deeply, fear of depending on someone who might not stay, fear of being disappointed like before. But in protecting themselves from those fears, they end up creating the very outcome they tried to avoid. Being alone again. The worst part of this realization is that it doesn't come all at once. It creeps in slowly, in moments they least expect. Maybe they see someone who reminds them of that person, or they read an old message that once made them smile. Maybe they catch themselves wanting to share good news, but realize there's no one who truly knows them like that anymore. Each small reminder chips away at the illusion of control they once held so tightly. They begin to realize that emotional distance didn't protect them. It robbed them of intimacy, warmth, and the chance to be fully known. Control feels powerful when things are predictable. But love, by nature, isn't predictable. It's messy, spontaneous, and deeply human. And those who spend their time trying to control their emotions often miss the very essence of what makes love meaningful. Its unpredictability, its depth, its ability to heal and expose at the same time. Avoidants, in their attempt to manage emotional outcomes, forget that relationships aren't meant to be managed, they're meant to be experienced. When they finally understand this, regret begins to surface. Regret for not saying what they felt, for holding back affection, for making someone who cared feel unwanted. They replay conversations, moments of silence, and words left unsaid. They start to see that control without connection is just isolation with a sophisticated disguise. And that's when they realize the harsh truth: they never really had control at all. They were controlled by their fear of closeness, their past wounds, and their need to feel safe at any cost. The illusion of control becomes the source of their greatest regret, because the person who once made them feel seen is gone, and all the power they thought they had means nothing without someone to share it with. The realization hurts deeply, not because they lost control, but because they finally understand that real strength was never in avoiding love. It was in being brave enough to surrender to it. Silence has a strange way of changing its meaning depending on who's listening. For an avoidant, silence once feels like safety, a space to breathe, a shield from the pressure of emotional intimacy. They tell themselves that quiet is peace, that distance means stability, that being alone means they're in control. When someone truly cares about them, that person's consistent presence often feels overwhelming. Every question like, "Are you okay?" or "Can we talk?" feels like a demand. The avoidant interprets genuine care as intrusion, not realizing that those small gestures are signs of love, not control. They withdraw, believing that pulling away is the way to keep balance. But after losing that person, silence takes on a different shape. It's no longer comforting, it's haunting. The silence that used to represent freedom now echoes with absence. There are no more texts lighting up their phone, no voice messages filled with laughter, no calls just to check in. The very things they once brushed off as unnecessary now become reminders of what's missing. At first, they try to convince themselves they're fine. They keep busy, fill their days with distractions, and tell themselves that the quiet is good for them. But as time goes on, the quiet begins to feel heavier. It starts to sound like regret, because in that silence, they begin to hear everything they ignored. The care in that person's tone, the patience in their understanding, the love in their presence. What once annoyed them now becomes sacred in memory. The silence starts to whisper questions they never wanted to ask. Did I push them too far? Did they ever feel loved by me? What would have happened if I had opened up even a little? These thoughts don't come all at once. They arrive slowly, usually at night, when the distractions fade and the mind has nowhere left to hide. The peace that once felt like control now feels like loneliness in disguise. They begin to understand that silence without connection isn't tranquility, it's emptiness. It's the sound of missed chances, unspoken feelings, and the realization that someone who once filled that silence with warmth is no longer there to do so. Avoidants often crave distance because it gives them a sense of stability. But real peace doesn't come from isolation, it comes from trust. The trust that you can be seen, loved, and accepted without losing yourself. When they lose someone who truly cared, they start to see how valuable that trust was. The silence reminds them of moments they could have spoken, but didn't, times they could have shown love, but withheld it, and the countless chances they had to let that person in. What used to feel like personal strength, the ability to stay detached, begins to look like avoidance of real connection. There's also a subtle ache that grows with this silence, the absence of being emotionally known. Even if they're surrounded by people, the quiet remains. Because what they've lost isn't just a relationship, it's the emotional safety that person brought. Someone who understood their moods without explanation, who could read the difference between their irritation and their fear, who stayed even when they pushed away. The silence becomes the sound of that understanding disappearing. The quiet starts to turn on them. They begin to miss the sound of that person's voice, their laughter, their gentle reminders that love doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. They start to recognize how rare it was to have someone who didn't give up easily. But now, there's nothing left but the echo of their own thoughts. The peace they once defended so fiercely now feels like punishment. They realize something profound: silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's the ghost of what was once beautiful. It's the sound of love that could have grown had they been brave enough to nurture it. Avoidants often think they can live without closeness. But after losing someone who truly cared, they learn that life without emotional connection isn't freedom, it's survival without warmth. And while silence once felt like a safe haven, it becomes the very thing that reminds them of everything they were too afraid to keep. Recognition doesn't come to an avoidant all at once. It creeps in slowly, often disguised as nostalgia or a sudden wave of memory. After losing someone who truly cared, they begin to replay past moments in their mind, not to relive them, but to finally see them differently. At the time, they might have brushed off that person's patience as ordinary, their kindness as something everyone should give. They didn't realize that not everyone stays when things get hard. Not everyone continues to care after being pushed away, and not everyone loves through walls. But when that love is gone, recognition strikes like a quiet storm. It's the moment they realize how rare it was to be accepted fully, flaws and all, and how much they took that for granted. Avoidants often spend years believing that love comes with conditions or expectations. Their guard stays up because, somewhere deep down, they expect rejection. They convince themselves that no one could truly love them if they saw the full picture, the fears, the insecurities, the distance they use as defense. So when someone comes along and offers unconditional care, it feels unfamiliar. They test it without even knowing they're doing it. They pull back to see if the person will follow. They go silent to see if that person will wait. They push boundaries to see if love can survive their self-protection. And often, the person who truly cares does stay. For a while. They stay through the confusion, through the walls, through the cold responses that were never meant to hurt. They love consistently in ways the avoidant doesn't yet understand. But when that person finally leaves, not in anger, but in exhaustion, the reality hits. The avoidant realizes they weren't being tested, they were being loved. They weren't being pressured, they were being chosen. And now, that choice is gone. Recognition comes in waves of understanding that feel almost unbearable. Every moment of care that once felt intrusive now feels precious. Every patient response, every second chance, I understand, becomes a memory that carries both comfort and pain. They start to see how rare it was to be loved by someone who didn't demand perfection, but wanted presence. There's a deep grief in realizing the value of something only after it's gone. It's not just about losing a person, it's about realizing they were a mirror, one that reflected the parts of the avoidant they refused to acknowledge. That person didn't love them for their mask or their silence. They loved them for their depth, even when that depth was hidden behind fear. And now, without that mirror, the avoidant has to face themselves alone. They begin to understand that real love isn't about comfort, it's about growth. The one who cared was trying to help them grow, not control them. They were trying to show that vulnerability isn't weakness, but a bridge to connection. What hurts most is knowing that they had something extraordinary. Someone who saw their potential for love, even when they couldn't see it themselves. The avoidant begins to remember the small gestures. The person who noticed when they withdrew, who respected their space, but still checked in, who listened without judgment. It's in those memories that they realize how loved they truly were and how little they allowed themselves to receive it. That recognition becomes both their lesson and their punishment. This awareness reshapes their understanding of love. They start to see that true acceptance isn't common. It takes emotional maturity, empathy, and patience, qualities they once mistook for weakness. The person who cared for them didn't just offer love, they offered healing. And now that the avoidant has lost that, they begin to grasp how much they needed it. They realize that genuine love doesn't make demands. It creates space for authenticity. It doesn't take away freedom. It teaches responsibility for another heart. In the quiet aftermath of loss, recognition becomes the most powerful teacher. It humbles them. It reminds them that love isn't something to earn or test. It's something to honor when it appears. And as painful as it is, this realization becomes the turning point. Because once an avoidant truly recognizes the depth of what they lost, they can never see love the same way again. They learn, finally, that the greatest tragedy isn't being unloved. It's failing to recognize when you already were. Emotional numbness is often the avoidant's most trusted companion. It feels safe, predictable, and controlled. They tell themselves that by staying emotionally neutral, they're protecting their peace. When love starts to grow too deep, they retreat, shutting down feelings before they can take root. They convince themselves they're immune to heartbreak because they never fully let themselves feel. But after losing someone who truly cared, that emotional numbness starts to change. What once felt like strength begins to feel like emptiness. The walls that once kept pain out begin to trap them inside a loneliness that no distraction can fix. They don't even recognize it as loss. They move through their days as if nothing happened. They keep busy, avoid reminders, and act indifferent when the person's name comes up. They might even tell themselves, "It's better this way." But the truth is, numbness isn't peace, it's just delayed pain. And pain always finds its way out. Slowly, small cracks begin to form in their emotional armor. A song they used to listen to together suddenly feels unbearable. A random scent or phrase brings an unexpected flood of memories. They try to push it down, to regain control, but emotions that have been buried too long don't disappear. They demand to be felt. It's in those quiet, unguarded moments that the craving begins. The craving for what they once denied themselves. Connection, closeness, warmth. The same love they once found suffocating now feels like oxygen they can't reach. They start to remember the comfort of having someone who understood their moods, someone who noticed their silence and didn't walk away. The longing becomes physical, a tightness in the chest, a restless feeling that no amount of logic can soothe. It's not just about missing the person, it's about missing the version of themselves that could still feel. Because for so long, they equated numbness with control, and now they realize that control has cost them their capacity to love freely. Avoidants often think emotions make them weak, but when the numbness fades, they see that emotions are what make life meaningful. Without them, experiences feel hollow. Achievements lose their joy, and quiet nights lose their peace. The absence of feeling becomes more painful than any heartbreak could ever be. They begin to crave not just the person they lost, but the emotional aliveness that came with them. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of being truly seen. It's a deep hunger for connection, but one that feels impossible to satisfy because the very defenses that once protected them now stand between them and the life they long for. The craving isn't always romantic. Sometimes it's the desire to be known again, to be understood without explanation. They realize that the person who truly cared didn't just fill a space in their life, they reached a place within them that no one else could. That kind of emotional intimacy doesn't come often, and losing it creates a void that logic can't reason away. The avoidant starts to recognize that love isn't a threat but a mirror, one that reflects back both their beauty and their fears. And now that the mirror is gone, they miss even the discomfort it brought, because at least it made them feel alive. As the numbness cracks open, guilt and longing often follow. They start to wish they had said more, shown more, allowed themselves to be vulnerable just once. They think about the moments when they could have softened, but instead chose silence. Those choices now feel like missed chances to feel love more deeply. They begin to see that the heart's natural state isn't to be guarded, it's to be open. And while that openness once felt dangerous, now it feels like the only way to truly live. The craving becomes a teacher. It shows them that numbness isn't protection, it's paralysis. That the cost of emotional safety is often the loss of emotional depth. And when they finally understand that, something inside begins to shift. They start to see that feeling deeply isn't the problem. It's the avoidance of feeling that causes the real pain. The emotional craving they once feared becomes their compass, guiding them back toward connection, vulnerability, and the kind of love they once pushed away. Because in the end, no matter how strong their walls are, the human heart always finds a way to feel again. Awareness comes late for the avoidant, and it rarely arrives gently. It usually shows up after the damage is done, when the person who once cared has already walked away and the quiet aftermath forces them to confront themselves. For so long, they believed that love was supposed to be effortless, that emotions should be controlled and predictable, that distance kept them safe. They thought showing vulnerability meant losing strength, and needing someone meant losing freedom. But when the person who truly cared is gone, that belief system begins to collapse. What they once called independence now feels like isolation, and what they called emotional control starts to look like avoidance of responsibility. It's in this painful clarity that awareness begins to grow, the understanding that love was never the problem. Their fear of it was. The first sign of this awareness is discomfort. They start to feel the weight of choices they once dismissed. The moments they avoided deep conversations now replay in their minds with new meaning. The times they stayed silent instead of saying, "I care," or "I'm sorry," now echo louder than ever. They begin to realize that withholding emotion isn't neutral. It's a form of neglect. Emotional responsibility isn't just about managing one's own feelings, but also recognizing how your actions affect someone else's heart. The avoidant, who once prided themselves on staying calm and detached, now starts to see that emotional detachment often leaves destruction in its wake. The realization is sharp: their calm wasn't strength, it was fear disguised as control. With awareness comes guilt, but it's a different kind of guilt, one mixed with awakening. They begin to see how love requires showing up, not just being present. That emotional responsibility means being accountable for your patterns, your silences, your defenses. It's realizing that love isn't just about not hurting someone. It's about making them feel safe enough to be themselves. For avoidants, this is a hard truth to accept. They spent years thinking they were protecting others by keeping distance, when in reality, they were protecting themselves from the very vulnerability that builds trust. This awareness often changes how they see love entirely. They start to understand that love isn't about control, it's about cooperation. It's not about maintaining power, but about sharing space. They realize that connection doesn't destroy independence, it deepens it. Because when two people love responsibly, they don't lose themselves, they expand together. The avoidant begins to see that emotional responsibility doesn't mean losing freedom. It means using that freedom to care, to communicate, to choose love over fear. But awareness also brings sorrow because they can't go back. They can't undo the moments they pushed someone away when they should have let them in. They can't rewrite the times they ignored affection or dismissed vulnerability. The person who once offered unconditional care may have moved on, and now the avoidant stands face to face with their own reflection, seeing clearly, for the first time, the role they played in their loss. The pain of this realization is deep, but it's also the beginning of growth. Through this awareness, they start to take ownership of their emotions. They stop blaming others for making them uncomfortable and begin asking why they fear closeness in the first place. They start to understand their patterns. How every retreat, every shutdown, every cold response was a shield against rejection. They begin to learn that maturity in love means staying open even when it feels risky. It means taking emotional responsibility for your reactions instead of hiding behind the excuse of being just the way I am. This awareness can become transformative. The same person who once ran from connection begins to crave it, not from a place of need, but from understanding. They realize that love doesn't need to be perfect, it needs to be present. They start to practice what they once resisted: communication, empathy, vulnerability. They learn to express rather than suppress, and in doing so, they begin to heal. The beauty of this awareness is that it doesn't just bring regret, it brings hope. Because now they know better. They see that emotional responsibility isn't about being flawless. It's about being honest, accountable, and brave enough to love again, differently this time. The pain that once broke them becomes the lesson that rebuilds them. And in that awareness, they finally understand that love isn't something to escape from. It's something to grow into. Pain has a strange way of becoming a teacher when everything else fails. For the avoidant, who has spent years running from vulnerability, pain becomes the one thing they can't escape. When they lose someone who truly cared, the loss doesn't just leave a void in their life. It opens a doorway to self-reflection. At first, they resist it. They try to numb the ache with distractions, with routine, with denial. But the human heart has limits, and eventually, the truth seeps through the cracks. The pain of losing someone who loved them unconditionally becomes too sharp to ignore. And in that pain, something unexpected begins to grow. Awareness, humility, and the desire to change. Avoidants often spend their lives avoiding emotional intensity. They confuse calm with control and think that detachment equals strength. But pain strips away all illusions. It exposes everything they tried to hide from themselves. The fear of abandonment, the deep craving for connection, the sadness of never having let themselves be truly known. The very loss they feared becomes the mirror that forces them to see their own reflection clearly. They realize that all along, they weren't protecting themselves from love, they were protecting themselves from their own vulnerability. Pain becomes the mirror that reflects both their wounds and their potential for healing. As the grief settles, a new kind of self-awareness begins to form. They start to understand that pain, as unbearable as it feels, is proof of depth, Proof that they cared more than they ever admitted. The tears they fought to suppress begin to fall, and with them, the emotional numbness starts to dissolve. The heart that was once closed off begins to soften. They start to see that pain isn't their enemy, it's their body and soul trying to realign with truth. The truth that love, though risky, is what makes life meaningful. They begin to understand that to love deeply means to risk deeply, and that avoiding that risk only guarantees emptiness. This growth hidden in pain is slow and often quiet. It doesn't come from reading a book or hearing advice. It comes from sitting in silence with themselves and realizing that every relationship they pushed away was a reflection of their own unhealed parts. They begin to ask the hard questions. Why do I fear being loved? Why does closeness feel unsafe? Why does vulnerability feel like exposure instead of intimacy? These questions lead them inward, to places they've ignored for years. They begin to see that healing doesn't happen through avoidance. It happens through awareness and action. With time, the pain transforms into perspective. They start to appreciate the lessons that love tried to teach them. Patience, empathy, communication, emotional courage. The memory of the person they lost becomes a symbol, not just of heartbreak, but of transformation. That person taught them that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, and that it's not about control but connection. They realized that losing someone who truly cared wasn't punishment, it was an invitation to evolve. It was life's way of showing them that love cannot be sustained by fear and that walls, no matter how strong, always collapse under the weight of truth. The avoidant begins to open again, but differently this time. They don't chase love from a place of emptiness, but from understanding. They know now that the pain they felt wasn't wasted. It broke them open in ways comfort never could. They become more mindful, more present, more aware of how their actions and silences affect others. So they start to practice vulnerability, not as a risk, but as a responsibility. The fear of being hurt never completely disappears, but it's no longer in control. In this stage of growth, they finally understand that pain isn't there to destroy them. It's there to awaken them. It reminds them of their capacity to feel, to care, to connect. The same pain that once made them withdraw now becomes the force that pushes them toward healing. And in learning to face it instead of flee from it, they discover the most powerful truth of all: love doesn't break you. It breaks you open, so you can finally become who you were meant to be. What avoidants discover is that love was never the enemy, fear was. Every wall they built, every silence they kept, every moment they pulled away was driven by the quiet belief that closeness leads to pain. But when the person who truly cared is gone, they realize that distance hurts even more. Losing someone genuine becomes the turning point. The moment they finally understand that love requires courage, not control. The feelings they face afterward, regret, loneliness, recognition, craving, and awareness, are not punishments but lessons guiding them back to their humanity. Through the ache of loss, they learn that emotional connection isn't something to run from, it's something to grow toward. The greatest healing begins when they stop seeing vulnerability as weakness and start seeing it as strength. Because love at its core is not about being perfect or fearless. It's about being present, real, and open enough to let someone in. When avoidants finally embrace that truth, they no longer live in fear of losing someone who cares. They begin to cherish love, nurture it, and honor it. And in doing so, they transform pain into wisdom, loneliness into empathy, and regret into the quiet, powerful promise to love better next time.